Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Shudder. It's been about a year and a half since we visited the MCU in Spider-Man Far From Home. That movie opened in July of 2019, which is not only the longest gap between MCU projects, I think it kind of feels even farther back than it is because so much has changed since then. So WandaVision, the very first Marvel TV show made in-house by Marvel Studios themselves, comes at a very important moment for the MCU. The first thing released after a long forced hiatus. Which makes it especially interesting because WandaVision is very unlike anything the MCU has ever done. Now, there's nothing particularly new about satirizing old sitcoms, but I think enough of what WandaVision is doing actually does feel odd and different enough that the show manages to feel fresh. The first two episodes are kind of difficult to talk about without the context of the rest of the show, but I wanted to dig into them this week. What I liked, what didn't quite land for me, and what I hope to see in the future. Oh, and obviously there will be spoilers for the first two episodes.
Sam, where are you?
Right here.
I honestly have no idea how WandaVision will play for people who don't have at least a decent familiarity with American sitcoms of the early and mid-1960s. Which is kind of a bold move from Marvel, a studio that usually aims to be as accessible as possible. But in these first two episodes at least, a working knowledge of the Dick Van Dyke Show and Bewitched are much more important than having seen the Avengers. And the show, which follows Wanda and Vision being trapped in a series of sitcoms, isn't exactly concerned about easing you into things. If you thought there'd be some more traditional MCU material setting up how they ended up here, you'd be wrong. The first episode doesn't give you that, instead diving headfirst into Donna Reed show material, with Wanda as a housewife and Vision heading off to a job he doesn't really understand. And right away, the strange balancing act the show is trying to pull off becomes clear. Obviously, it's not just a straightforward old-fashioned sitcom. There's something sinister going on around the edges of the series that I'm sure will come more into focus as the season goes on. But for the vast majority of its running time, at least in these first episodes, it is functioning mostly as a sitcom. There's wacky misunderstandings, old-school joke writings that would fit in the television of the time, and of course, most of it is filmed with the classic 3-camera setup in black and white. That's not just for a fun scene or two, that is the show. And I can see that being a big problem for people who show up expecting a more traditional superhero experience. But putting all that MCU baggage aside, how do these episodes stand up on their own? Honestly, pretty well, I think. For me, the second episode is much stronger than the first. Where the first feels like it's kind of riffing on the type of sitcoms we've seen mocked countless times before, the second episode takes aim at shows like Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie, most clearly seen in some of their very fun little animated segments. And I think it feels a little more specific and more unique because of that. That being said, there is still quite a bit to like about episode 1. And I don't want to skip over the highlight, where Vision's boss and his wife come over for dinner. It's a situation very much based on the Dick Van Dyke Show specifically, with Vision's boss being pretty clearly inspired by the grumpy, bald-headed Mel Cooley, Rob's producer boss on the classic show. WandaVision even went that extra mile, bringing in Van Dyke himself to consult on the show. And visually, I think they really nailed it. The lighting and the sets do a pretty amazing job of recreating that style. Sure, it is shot on digital and not film, I think that's clearly the biggest difference, but other than that, it's incredibly faithful to the look of those shows. Even Wanda's magic is done with simple in-camera effects and basic wire work, to recreate how those effects would have been done on a show like Bewitched. With all that in place, they pull off the dinner scene really well. Now the gags are very goofy and kind of basic, which I honestly think is unfair to the Dick Van Dyke Show, which did have some pretty clever writing, but I don't really mind because it's all in service of the tonal shift that comes at the dinner table. When the boss starts questioning the couple about their past and eventually starts choking on some food. His wife's reaction is to sit there like a buffering computer program, giving us a pretty good hint that these aren't real people, but some kind of magic or technology. These little clues as to what's really going on don't last long though, and soon it's back to the sitcom status quo. but thankfully for WandaVision, it has two leads that are really good at that aspect of the show. Both Elizabeth Olson and Paul Bettany fall into these heightened versions of their characters like they've been playing them for years. Like Bettany especially is called on to do a lot of over-the-top 60s sitcom acting and seems to be having a pretty great time with it. He's been a likable presence in past Marvel films, especially in Age of Ultron, where I actually think his conversation with Ultron is the best scene in the movie, but he gets to show a very different side of the character here. A more comedic take that allows him to get involved in some very goofy storylines, like say, a piece of gum making him malfunction while not undercutting the vision that came before. Olson also handles herself well. It may always be a little funny to me how they dropped her kind of half-assed fake accent between movies, but here, unlike Endgame, it at least makes a lot of sense and serves a narrative purpose. I do like how they use her Sokovian origins for some slapstick comedy. I think it was a smart way to have her tragic backstory work with the sitcom tone instead of against it. Elizabeth Olson broke into the industry with a lot of roles in darker indie films, but here she kinda gets to channel her older sisters, who of course got their start on Full House, a show that I expect WandaVision to riff on later down the line. So far, neither of them have had to do a lot of dramatic heavy lifting, and while I expect that to change, it has been kinda cool getting to see the actors tackle a tone and style that they've never had in the MCU before. The height of that was definitely the town talent show, probably the funniest scene in WandaVision so far, and definitely the most over the top. I'm glad they're changing up the sitcom style every episode because I think relying on these old-fashioned gags could get old, but with just one short episode in each era, I think it works well, at least so far.
So let's go! Kellogg's Rice Krispies, Kellogg's Rice Krispies.
I've seen people complain about the very long credit sequence. I think between the intro and the end credits, it ends up being something like 6.5 minutes of screen time or something, which does seem kind of strange. Honestly though, and I'm just guessing here, I think it might have been done purposefully because it gets the show to the actual short running time of a network sitcom with commercials, which definitely helps it mirror the beats and act breaks of those shows. The fake commercials also do this, but I'm not really sold on those yet. They're these ads for old Stark tech, but I wish they were heightened to be either more funny or more creepy. As they are, they're kind of just there, though I am more than willing to be proven wrong if the show ends up having a good reason for using them this way. One character I should probably talk about is Dottie, played by Buffy the Vampire Slayer's Emma Caulfield. In episode 2, she's the head of the talent show planning committee, enforcing this very suburban conformity on everyone. But it's definitely implied that there's more going on there. She seems to be one of the few that can recognize these breaks in reality, like when a strange voice yelling for Wanda cuts into a Beach Boys song. I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess that she is a real person trapped in this reality too, but having only seen her in an episode so far, it's pretty hard to say. Either way though, I'm really curious to see how they'll use Dottie, as I can easily see her becoming an ally of Wanda's or the main villain of the entire show. Then there's that great final scene, where the world transforms into full color with Wanda now pregnant and in 70s clothes. Then there seems to be some kind of rupture in reality that leads the couple outside to see a guy dressed as a beekeeper standing in the middle of the road, until Wanda apparently rejects this reality and time is rewinded. Those little breaks in the sitcom world work really well, I think, because they're shot in such a different style than the rest of the show. So when it happens, it feels wrong. It feels like something is piercing the veil of this world that's somehow been created for them. Obviously, I have a lot more questions than answers right now, but I think this was a promising start for the show. I'm interested to see if it can maintain that balancing act between slapstick sitcom and the horror undertones. I'm looking forward to seeing their takes on sitcoms from other decades, but I think what I'm most excited about is to see how that reality collapses. The show is so committed to this old-fashioned aesthetic that when anything intrudes on that, it feels genuinely unsettling. And I think that might be the show's greatest accomplishment so far. In these first 2 episodes at least, whether you love the MCU or you hate it, you can't accuse WandaVision of being a carbon copy of its big screen brothers. And I think that's what has me the most excited. The beekeeper at the end of the second episode of WandaVision was a nice little horror touch, but maybe it puts you in the mood to watch some all-out horror shows or a classic movie. That's where Shudder comes in. I've been a Shudder member for years now. They're like Netflix for horror, but in a much more helpful way. Shudder is curated and does a great job of steering you to the good stuff. Classic horror films, under-the-radar gems, and great TV binges, they've got it all. And new stuff is added every week. This month they have The Walking Dead World Beyond, Hunted, and The Queen of Black Magic. One of my favorites is Channel Zero, a really great horror anthology show that has some of the creepiest imagery I've ever seen on TV. That's just one example though. Shudder has an amazing collection of original series and blockbuster films. It's available on a ton of devices too: Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, and more. You can sign up for only $5.99 a month or $56.99 for an entire year. So get started streaming the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content. Shudder's expertly curated collection includes must-see titles like Color Out of Space, Host, the Mortuary Collections, plus all the best horror documentaries and the hit Creepshow TV series from executive producer Greg Nicotero of The Walking Dead. To try Shudder free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code MIDNIGHT. That's Shudder, SHUDDER.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.